December 7th, 1941. 7:48 in the morning, Hawaii time. Wave after wave of Japanese aircraft scream out of the clouds above Pearl Harbor. In less than 2 hours, over 2,400 Americans are dead. The battleship fleet of the United States Navy lies broken or burning at the bottom of the harbor, and a nation that had spent 2 decades telling itself never again is at war. But barely 20 years earlier, that same nation had marched home from Europe utterly convinced it would never fight another foreign war again. To understand how America ended up burning in the Pacific, we have to go back to a ship, a treaty, and a promise that was broken almost as soon as it was made. In 1918, President Woodrow Wilson sailed to Europe as the most powerful man on earth. He carried with him a vision, a League of Nations, a new world order where war itself would become obsolete, resolved by debate instead of by armies. The crowds in Paris cheered him like a savior. He believed he could remake the world in America's image, an image of democracy, self-determination, and permanent peace, and for a few short months it seemed possible. He came home to something very different. The U.S. Senate, wary of foreign entanglements and haunted by the cost of the war just ended, over 116,000 American dead in barely 19 months of fighting, refused to ratify the treaty. Henry Cabot Lodge and other senators argued that membership in the League could drag America into future European wars automatically, without a vote, without a choice. Wilson refused to compromise, campaigned across the country to build public support, suffered a debilitating stroke in the effort, and lost anyway. America would not join its own president's league. It turned inward, and it stayed there for a generation. Through the 1920s, the country chased prosperity instead of power. Wall Street boomed. Cars rolled off assembly lines by the millions. Radios and refrigerators found their way into ordinary homes. This was the Jazz Age, an era that wanted to forget the trenches of France entirely and look only forward. Isolation wasn't just policy. It was the mood of an entire generation that had watched Europe tear itself apart over tangled alliances and old grudges and wanted nothing more to do with any of it. Congress even passed strict immigration quotas in 1924, closing the door that had once welcomed millions from that same troubled continent. Then, in October 1929, the mood shattered along with the stock market. A quarter of the workforce lost their jobs. Bread lines stretched around city blocks. Families lost their homes and their savings overnight, and shanty towns of the displaced, bitterly nicknamed Hoovervilles after the president many blamed for the collapse, sprang up in every major city. America turned even further inward, consumed entirely by its own catastrophe, with little attention or sympathy left over for the rest of the world's problems. Franklin Roosevelt won the presidency in 1932, promising a New Deal to rebuild the country from the inside out. Foreign policy was, for the moment, almost an afterthought. While America looked away, 3 other nations were watching their moment arrive. Japan faced a hard truth. Its population was exploding. It had almost no natural resources of its own, and its rapidly industrializing economy could not grow without coal, iron, and oil it did not possess. Its military leaders looked north and west, to the rich farmland and mineral wealth of Manchuria in northern China. In 1931, without even informing its own civilian government, the Japanese army manufactured a pretext, a small explosion on a railway line it blamed on Chinese saboteurs, seized the city of Mukden, and overran the entire territory within months. A puppet state called Manchukuo was declared, with the last emperor of China installed as its powerless figurehead. The League of Nations condemned the invasion in the strongest terms it could muster. Japan's answer was simple. Its delegates stood up, declared the League's findings unacceptable, and walked out of the building. Nobody stopped them. Nobody could, and everybody watching in Berlin and Rome took careful note of exactly how little it cost. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had already spent a decade building a fascist dictatorship out of the chaos of a broken post-war democracy. He had marched on Rome in 1922 with a country paralyzed by strikes and instability, and once in power he crushed his political opposition, appointed rather than elected his government, and ran the country through the fascist Grand Council alone. Public works programs and a rebuilt military made him popular at home and admired, disturbingly, by right-wing movements across Europe, including a struggling political agitator in Munich named Adolf Hitler. In 1935, seeking to build his own modern Roman Empire, Mussolini's forces invaded Ethiopia, one of the last independent nations in Africa. Ethiopian tribesmen armed with little more than rifles and spears faced Italian tanks, aircraft, and outlawed poison gas dropped from the sky. Emperor Haile Selassie traveled to Geneva himself and pleaded with the League of Nations to honor its own founding principles. The League imposed sanctions so weak they barely inconvenienced Rome, and within 6 months, Ethiopia was entirely overrun. Once again, the world's peacekeeping body had shown its teeth were made of paper, and once again, nobody with the power to stop it was willing to try. In Germany, a defeated and humiliated nation was being remade by a man who had turned national grievance into a political weapon. Adolf Hitler blamed Germany's collapse on its politicians, on its Jewish citizens, on the punishing terms of the Treaty of Versailles itself, and he promised to restore what had been taken. He built the small Nazi Party into a genuine mass movement during the Great Depression, when 6 million unemployed Germans found extremist promises more appealing than a paralyzed democratic government, and by 1933 he was chancellor. Within 18 months, he had banned every rival party, seized absolute power as Führer, and begun a secret rearmament program forbidden entirely under Versailles. Freed step by step from the treaty's restrictions and encouraged by the world's failure to respond to Japan and Italy, Hitler unveiled a new air force in 1935, reoccupied the demilitarized Rhineland on France's own border in 1936, and absorbed Austria into the Reich in 1938 without a single shot fired. That same year, Hitler turned his attention to the German-speaking Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia. At a hastily arranged conference in Munich in September 1938, with Mussolini acting as mediator, Britain and France handed him the territory outright in exchange for his solemn personal promise that he wanted nothing more. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew home waving a piece of paper bearing Hitler's signature, calling it peace for our time to cheering crowds. Within 6 months, in March 1939, German tanks rolled into the rest of Czechoslovakia anyway, seizing territory that was not even ethnically German, and the illusion that Hitler could be satisfied finally collapsed for good. Even as all of this unfolded in Europe and Asia, a third, quieter proving ground had opened in Spain, where a brutal civil war erupted in 1936 between the elected Republican government and nationalist rebels under General Francisco Franco. Hitler and Mussolini poured in tanks, aircraft, and tens of thousands of troops to back Franco, using the conflict openly as a testing ground for the new weapons and tactics they intended to use on a much larger stage. Stalin sent limited aid to the Republic, while Britain, France, and the United States all stood back under a policy of non-intervention. When Franco's forces finally triumphed in 1939, Hitler and Mussolini took away a clear lesson. The democracies would talk, and they would wring their hands, but they would not act. Through all of this, Washington watched from a great distance and drew a simple lesson of its own. Whatever was happening over there was not America's fight. Congress passed a series of neutrality acts through the 1930s, actively making it illegal for the United States to sell arms or extend credit to nations at war, even nations that were the clear and blameless victims of aggression. The thinking was straightforward, and to many Americans, entirely reasonable. The last war had been sold to the public as a fight to end all wars, and instead it had produced this: a fragile peace collapsing in slow motion, one broken promise at a time. Why send American sons to die fixing a mess that Europe and Asia had made entirely for themselves? When Japan resumed its full-scale invasion of China in July 1937, the brutality was almost impossible to comprehend. Cities were bombed indiscriminately from the air, entire civilian populations targeted deliberately. When the Chinese capital of Nanjing fell in December of that year, Japanese soldiers embarked on a 6-week campaign of massacre, rape, and atrocity that killed an estimated 300,000 civilians. Japanese aircraft even attacked American and British gunboats sent to protect shipping on the Yangtze River, deliberately sinking the USS Panay and killing American sailors in the process. Washington accepted a formal apology and an indemnity payment from Tokyo and quietly moved on. President Roosevelt floated the idea of an international quarantine against aggressor nations in a major speech that same year, but the public reaction was so hostile that he dropped the idea almost immediately. There would be no naval blockade, no declaration, nothing beyond strongly worded protests. The American public had no appetite for a war on the other side of the world, and their elected representatives knew it better than anyone. America wanted no part of what was coming. What it did not yet understand was that the fires burning in Europe and Asia were converging toward it anyway, and that neutrality laws written on paper could not hold back a world sliding steadily toward total war. By September 1939, Hitler's tanks were rolling into Poland from the west, while Stalin's Red Army moved in from the east under a secret pact the two dictators had signed only days before, a pact that shocked a world which had assumed fascism and communism were natural enemies. Britain and France, bound by treaty to defend Poland, declared war within days. Europe was at war again, barely 21 years after the guns had fallen silent the first time. President Franklin Roosevelt saw the danger far more clearly than most of his countrymen. He believed, correctly, that an unchecked Nazi Germany, controlling the resources and industry of an entire continent, would eventually threaten the Western Hemisphere itself. But he was boxed in by a public and a Congress deeply committed to staying out, and by an isolationist movement embodied by prominent figures like the famous aviator Charles Lindbergh and the mass membership of the America First Committee that commanded genuine and vocal support in every part of the country. Roosevelt's answer was patience and incremental persuasion rather than open confrontation. Neutrality laws were loosened just enough under a cash and carry system to let Britain and France purchase American weapons, but strictly for cash up front and strictly carried home on their own ships, so that no American vessel could be drawn directly into the fighting. Then France collapsed in June 1940, in barely 6 weeks, a defeat so swift and total it stunned the entire world and left Britain standing alone against Hitler across the narrow waters of the English Channel. Roosevelt watched the Battle of Britain unfold that summer and autumn, German bombers pounding London and other cities night after night in an effort to bomb the British people into surrender, and understood clearly that if Britain fell too, the United States would face an entirely hostile, fascist-dominated Atlantic with no allies left standing between Europe and America's own shores. Britain, meanwhile, was running out of money and running dangerously low on ships. Roosevelt first arranged to trade 50 aging American destroyers for basing rights in British territories, then found a far larger way around his own neutrality laws with the Lend-Lease Act of March 1941. America would lend, rather than sell, the tools of war to any nation whose defense the president deemed vital to American security, to be repaid later, in kind or in cash, whenever the fighting was finally over. It was not quite an act of war. It was no longer neutrality either, and everyone on both sides of the Atlantic and the Pacific understood exactly what it meant. Roosevelt went further still. American warships began escorting convoys partway across the Atlantic, and by the autumn of 1941, an undeclared shooting war was already underway at sea. German U-boats attacked the destroyer USS Greer in September and torpedoed the USS Kearney in October, killing 11 American sailors, and sank the USS Reuben James later that month, killing over 100 more. Roosevelt authorized American ships to fire on sight against German vessels in defense zones stretching far out into the Atlantic. The United States and Nazi Germany were, in every practical sense except a formal declaration, already at war on the ocean before a single shot had been fired in the Pacific. Across the Pacific, Japan read Lend-Lease and the Atlantic Charter, a joint statement of war aims Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill signed at sea in August 1941, as precisely what they were: unmistakable proof that the United States had chosen a side. And Japan, at the very same moment, was running out of options of its own. Its war in China had ground on for 4 years with no end in sight, consuming resources and manpower far faster than its home islands could supply them. It needed oil, rubber, and steel to keep its army and navy running, and it had set its sights on the resource-rich European colonies of Southeast Asia, British Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, French Indochina, all of them suddenly vulnerable now that their parent nations were occupied or fighting desperately for survival in Europe. In July 1941, Japanese forces moved into southern Indochina, positioning themselves for a further push south toward those colonies. Roosevelt's response was the most powerful weapon the United States possessed without firing a single shot. He froze all Japanese assets in America, and alongside Britain and the Dutch government in exile, cut off oil exports to Japan almost entirely. It is difficult to overstate how severe this was for Tokyo. Japan imported nearly 80% of its oil from the United States. Without it, the Imperial Navy's ships and the Imperial Army's aircraft had, by most internal estimates, less than 2 years of fuel reserves left before they would grind to a complete halt. Japan's leadership now faced a choice that felt, to them, like no real choice at all. Withdraw from China and abandon 2 decades of imperial ambition, humiliating the military and risking economic collapse at home, or seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies by force, which meant certain and immediate war with the one power in the entire Pacific capable of stopping them: the United States. Through the autumn of 1941, diplomats in Washington and Tokyo continued to talk, exchanging proposals and counterproposals that satisfied neither side. Cordell Hull, the American Secretary of State, insisted Japan withdraw from China entirely as the price of restored trade. Tokyo considered this an impossible demand, a demand for total surrender of everything it had fought for and sacrificed for since 1931. General Hideki Tojo became prime minister in October 1941, a clear sign that the military hardliners who favored war had won the internal argument in Tokyo. While the diplomats kept talking for the sake of appearances, Japan's combined fleet trained in secret for something else entirely. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had studied at Harvard and served as a naval attaché in Washington years earlier, understood America far better than almost anyone else in Tokyo's high command. He had seen its factories, its oil fields, its sheer, uninterrupted industrial scale firsthand, and he privately believed Japan could not win a prolonged war against the United States under any realistic circumstances. His plan was built entirely around that grim assessment. Japan's only chance was a single, overwhelming, opening blow, one devastating enough to cripple America's Pacific Fleet in a single stroke, and by 6 months to a year, in which Japan could seize the resources it desperately needed and fortify its new empire before American industrial power could fully mobilize and turn against it. On November 26, 1941, a Japanese strike force of 6 aircraft carriers, escorted by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, slipped out of a remote, fog-shrouded anchorage in the Kuril Islands under strict radio silence and turned east, across the empty winter Pacific, toward Hawaii. For nearly 2 weeks it steamed forward almost entirely undetected, its sailors and pilots told only at sea exactly what their target would be. In Washington, American codebreakers had already cracked Japan's diplomatic ciphers through a top-secret program known as MAGIC, and officials knew with near certainty that an attack was coming somewhere in the Pacific within days, perhaps hours. War warnings went out to American commanders across the region on November 27th. Military installations in the Philippines and the Panama Canal were placed on high alert, bracing for exactly this kind of assault. Pearl Harbor received a warning too, but one framed almost entirely around the danger of local sabotage by Japanese residents rather than a full-scale carrier strike from the open ocean, and its aircraft were parked wingtip to wingtip on open runways as a result. easier to guard against saboteurs on the ground, and catastrophically easier for enemy pilots to destroy in a single pass from the air. By the first days of December 1941, the Japanese fleet was closing the final distance to Hawaii, and the nation it was sailing toward still believed, as it had believed for 20 years, that the wars of the world were someone else's problem, fought on someone else's soil, for someone else's reasons that need not touch American lives at all. On the morning of December 7th, that belief had less than an hour left to live. The first wave of Japanese aircraft struck at 7:48, targeting the battleships moored along what sailors called Battleship Row. The USS Arizona exploded and sank within minutes, taking more than 1,100 men down with her. The Oklahoma capsized. 6 other battleships were damaged or destroyed alongside cruisers, destroyers, and nearly 200 aircraft caught helplessly on the ground exactly where the warnings had told commanders to park them. By the time the attack ended less than 2 hours later, 2,403 Americans were dead, and the Pacific Fleet's battle line had been shattered in a single morning. The following day, December 8th, President Roosevelt stood before a joint session of Congress and called it a date which will live in infamy. Within hours, the United States declared war on Japan with only a single dissenting vote in either House of Congress. 3 days later, honoring their own alliance obligations with Tokyo, Hitler and Mussolini declared war on the United States in turn, an act that, in hindsight, solved Roosevelt's greatest political problem for him by making the war in Europe unavoidable as well. America's 20-year retreat from the world's conflicts was over in a single week. The nation that had spent an entire generation insisting it wanted no part of a global war now found itself fighting 2 of them at once, on opposite sides of the planet, its factories about to be turned over almost entirely to the largest military mobilization in its history, and there would be no turning inward again until both wars were finished for good. While the burning wreckage of the Pacific Fleet was still smoldering in the harbor, Japan struck the entire western edge of the Pacific simultaneously. In those same hours as Pearl Harbor, Japanese aircraft descended on American bases in the Philippines, destroying most of General Douglas MacArthur's heavy bombers on the ground, almost the same miscalculation that had cost the fleet its battleships in Hawaii. Japanese forces landed in Malaya and within weeks drove British forces back to Singapore, which had been considered an impregnable fortress and fell in February 1942. The largest surrender in British military history. Hong Kong surrendered on Christmas Day. The Dutch East Indies, with its oil fields, the very prize Japan had gone to war for in the first place, fell into Japanese hands by March. In the Philippines, American and Filipino forces retreated to the Bataan Peninsula and the island of Corregidor and held out there for 4 months without reinforcements or supplies, eventually reduced to eating horses and monkeys. Roosevelt ordered MacArthur to leave the island by torpedo boat, and as he departed he made a promise that would become famous. "I shall return." The remaining garrison surrendered in April and May of 1942, and the prisoners were marched to camps under such brutal conditions that the march went down in history as the Bataan Death March, claiming thousands of lives. By the spring of 1942, the Japanese Empire stretched from the borders of India to the islands of the South Pacific, from Manchuria to within striking distance of Australia, the largest empire by area in the history of Asia, built in under 6 months. But Yamamoto had been right in his grim assessment even before the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor. Japan had been granted a window, not an eternity. In April 1942, 16 American bombers under Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle took off from a carrier in the open ocean and delivered a symbolic strike on Tokyo itself, one that caused almost no military damage. The physical toll was small, but the psychological effect was enormous. Japan's high command, which had promised its people that the home islands were untouchable, had been humiliated and resolved to eliminate the threat from American carriers once and for all. In May 1942, in the Coral Sea, the Japanese and American fleets fought each other for the first time in history without ever coming within sight of one another. Every blow was struck by carrier aircraft. The outcome was inconclusive, but the Japanese advance on Port Moresby was stopped. A month later, in June 1942, at Midway Atoll, American cryptographers once again broke Japan's codes and learned in advance where and when Yamamoto planned to strike his decisive blow. American carriers set an ambush and, within minutes, sank 4 Japanese carriers, the very backbone of the strike force that had descended on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. Midway became the turning point of the Pacific War. From that day on, Japan never advanced again, only defended. The next 3 years turned into a bloody campaign of island hopping: Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, where American Marines and soldiers clawed back fortified Japanese positions one by one at appalling cost, discovering along the way that Japanese troops almost never surrendered, choosing death instead. While these battles raged across the Pacific, the Allies were waging their own war of attrition against Germany. The Soviet Union, which Hitler had struck with a surprise invasion back in June 1941, fought battles of unprecedented scale and brutality. The siege of Leningrad, where hundreds of thousands of civilians starved to death, and the Battle of Stalingrad in the winter of 1942 to 1943, in which the German Sixth Army was surrounded and destroyed. The Wehrmacht's first crushing defeat and the turning point of the entire war in Europe. The United States and Britain landed in North Africa in late 1942, then in Sicily and mainland Italy in 1943, forcing Mussolini to resign, though German forces continued to hold the peninsula fiercely for nearly 2 more years. Throughout this period, Allied bombers waged a relentless strategic bombing campaign against German cities and industry, while Atlantic convoys fought their way through a screen of German U-boats to deliver the men and equipment to Britain for a blow that had long been in preparation. On June 6, 1944, a day that went down in history as D-Day, Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy in the largest amphibious operation in human history. After breaking through German defenses at enormous cost, the Allies liberated France over the summer, while the Red Army drove the Wehrmacht back all along the Eastern Front. A desperate German counteroffensive in the Ardennes in the winter of 1944 to 1945 delayed the Allied advance for a few weeks, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Soviet troops entered Berlin in April 1945. Hitler took his own life in his bunker on April 30th, and on May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. In the Pacific, by the summer of 1945, the war had reached Japan's very doorstep, but no end was in sight. The Battle of Okinawa in the spring of 1945 cost tens of thousands of lives on both sides and convinced American commanders that an invasion of the Japanese home islands itself would cost hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, of casualties, both military and civilian, given a population that appeared prepared to fight to the last. On August 6, 1945, an American bomber dropped the first atomic bomb ever used in combat on Hiroshima, obliterating the city in an instant. 3 days later, a second atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki. In that same span, on August 8th, the Soviet Union, honoring its commitment to the Allies, declared war on Japan and launched a swift offensive against Japanese forces in Manchuria. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed his people directly by radio for the first time in history and announced Japan's surrender. The formal signing ceremony took place on September 2nd aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The Second World War was over.